Exposed Bridge, Trees Down, Coalition Talk Radio. Loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network. Broadcasting at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of 1,000 stories. Folks, if you're watching this live, you know just how hideous it is. If you don't have to be out, please don't drive. There are trees down everywhere. Bridges intermittently closed because of high wind conditions. It looks like it's going to be a long night here in the capital city. If you're fortunate enough to have power, again, take a moment and charge your rechargeables, but take a moment too and stick with us tonight. We might be a slightly rain-shortened version of the Coalition tonight due to some issues with guests and transportation and connectivity. A good part of the Northeast is in and out of power. In the last hour, I've spoken with people in Washington, D.C. The Senate and the House was closed early today because of loss of power. New York is a mess. We'll be fine tomorrow, as anyone who's old enough will remember the scene after Ernest Borgnine got out of the boat from There's Got to Be a Morning After. I'll spare you that rendition. But there's lots to talk about this week. Not the least of which is possibly a generational case in front of the Supreme Court of the United States revolving around, astonishingly enough, free speech, the right to work, and really the entire establishment of the labor union community here in this country. And anyone who follows politics closely knows that then, as a result of that, if you follow the daisy chain effect, ultimately politics as they're conducted. Joining me live for the very first time is a senior member of an organization that we've grown quite fond of here in the Coalition. Of course, we're talking about the Goldwater Institute. He is, in fact, the Director of Litigation and General Counsel, and he is the spearhead of an organization that we've talked about that provocatively legislates, they litigate, they discuss, and they challenge us constantly. Despite being overtly libertarian and conservative in nature, they've won accords and accolades from no less than the New York Times, who points them out as a shining beacon amongst the chaos that's in Washington, D.C. That's my words. Of course, John Riches, welcome to the Coalition for the very first time. Thanks for joining us from sunny 70 degrees somewhere else.
Yeah. Thanks for the kind words and the introduction, and I'm sorry you're experiencing that out there. I hope everyone's safe in your viewer land. I don't miss those days as a student in Boston, and I won't describe the weather outside my window here.
Now you did law school here in Boston?
I went to actually undergrad in Boston at Boston College.
All right,
about an hour from Providence.
All right, so you're an Eagle then.
That's right.
And anyone who actually really understands Boston knows that Harvard does not run Boston. Boston College runs Boston. So
that's what we like to hear.
Absolutely. So, was I overstating the importance of this case? To me, this really has tentacles into every aspect of public life as we know it. Is it really that important?
I think so. I think it's one of the most important cases the court has heard in several terms, and the court has an opportunity now to correct a problem or to correct a mistake it made 40 years ago. Look, I mean, there's two separate things going on. The first is that the way the law exists right now in a lot of states, including Illinois, is if you want to work in the job of your choice for a government agency, you're forced to pay union dues, what they call agency fees.
Right.
And the union then takes that money and they spend it on collective bargaining. Now, as you know, collective bargaining is where a government representative sits down with another government representative and they talk about how to make government bigger. And if you disagree with that process, if you're Mark Janus, you don't have any choice but to finance it. They take money out of your paycheck to finance that process. Mm-hmm. So that forces you to pay for political positions that you may very well disagree with, namely the size and scope of government. So that's the first problem, and we talk about a couple others as well.
And the primary issue there is not the right of someone to organize collectively. It's when you look at government, you're missing that final safety valve that any important cog in capitalism has, whether it be labor, capital, or or raw materials. The notion that government can fail if government is unionized, the central issue is if they can then simultaneously grease the wheels of power and control both the workers' position as well as the management's position, government cannot fail. And as a result, we as taxpayers will always be beholden to an ever-burgeoning government. We have no control over it whatsoever, do we?
That's exactly right. And you really put your finger on the fundamental distinction between the way unions exist in the private sector, where you get a group of workers together and they might negotiate for higher pay, wages, working conditions, whatever. But there is at some point a ceiling. And at some point, businesses can fail. And they can't, at some point, pay what might be demanded of them by the unions. In the government, it's really different. Unfortunately, the government has essentially a bottomless trough from which to feed. So when they sit down at the negotiating table, it's taxpayer resources that are on the line. And I think, unfortunately, many politicians concede of that as a limitless supply of money. And that's a major problem. Of course, there's also a big difference between public unions and private unions, insofar as public unions have the advantage of being able to choose their own boss. We know that government unions are very, very, very politically active. We know they're very politically influential, and they can, through their political activities, elect a person that they then sit on the other side of the bargaining table, purportedly against, where both parties are really just advocating for larger government at the end of the day.
Right, and that's how we've faced, incredibly enough in Rhode Island, a recurring attempt to create what's called evergreen contracts, which if there was absolutely no check on power, and there is so little in Rhode Island, the concept of an evergreen contract is that if the collective bargaining process, even as stunted as it is in a public union, is not successful, you simply lock into perpetuity the existing contract. So there's absolutely no mechanism whatsoever, whether it be the quote-unquote financial failure of government or the collective bargaining process, to really stifle unchecked, out-of-control government spending. And that's how you have a situation like we do in Rhode Island, where the Senate president is literally a public unionista. And where do we go? Is there ever been any estimate to understand how much money is spent by public unions in terms of electioneering, if you will, on an annual basis? Is there any real number that you could place on that?
Well, first, I've read about this problem you have out in your state with the evergreen contracts, and that's a remarkable concept.
Yeah.
You have it good while the economy's good, and then when the economy goes bad, you also have it good. It's just totally immune from market forces,
right.
Which exacerbates another problem in the public sector, which is how do you even value this in a market context? It's almost impossible for a lot of these things. So it's a very, very different circumstance than we have in the private sector.
Right.
In terms of their political clout and activity, oh yeah, there's studies that have been done, federal, state, and local level. Public sector unions are some of the largest direct contributors when it comes to political spending. But then they also have an enormous political advantage in two other respects. They're very highly organized, so they can push information out to their members that can then go and engage in political activities. And then they have a very distinct lobbying advantage. It's the only circumstance under which one special interest is required by law to sit down and negotiate with the government or with a political representative. Mm-hmm. No other special interest gets that sort of treatment. They have to compete with other interests and argue over the proper allocation of tax dollars. But through the collective bargaining process, government unions have a exclusive seat at the table that nobody else enjoys.
So, in the words of the immortal, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, right.
I'll throw one out to you just for you something to chew on. Here in Rhode Island, we have something called the Carrillo Law, which was named after a former state legislator who managed to pass a law that allows, for lack of a better term, allows school boards to essentially sue into oblivion the municipality under which they kind of or allegedly serve, if in fact the financial standards of the school systems aren't met. Now, that sounds, in an altruistic alternate reality, that sounds like, well, that's a great idea to make sure that they force the town to give kids the books and things they need, when in reality, you and I know that if in fact the school board is not able to successfully negotiate against teachers unions, whatever other municipal unions exist out in zombie land, Rhode Island, then they have the right just to take the town to court.
Wow.
The party never ends.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So now, Mr. Janus, if you can give us a little background on him and then how this got to be. I mean, it's the notion that it's made it to the Supreme Court is kind of astonishing if you're a layman like myself. But how did we get here?
Mark Janus works for the state of Illinois. He's a child welfare worker. He didn't want to be part of his union, AFSCME. He didn't want anything to do with the union. He didn't want to be a union member. Yet, when he received his first paycheck, he was surprised to learn that $50 had been deducted from it and sent to AFSCME, to the union that he didn't want any part of. So he objected to that because he knew that AFSCME was going to use that money for all sorts of purposes. Now you should know that under existing law, unions are only supposed to use what they call agency fees, this money that they took from Mark, for collective bargaining. And the Supreme Court 40 years ago said, well, collective bargaining is okay because they have to do it. It's not necessarily political. Interestingly, agency fees for most unions account to about 89% of what regular union fees do, while collective bargaining is a tiny percentage of the time that they actually spend. So I think the unions might be coming up with funny math in a lot of these cases when they are seeking reimbursement for agency fees when it amounts to almost full fees in most cases, including in Mark's case, where his agency fees accounted to about 80% of what a regular union member would pay. In any event, what Mark argued is, and what he's arguing now, is that collective bargaining is a political process. When you sit down at the bargaining table, the union is arguing for bigger government, more benefits, more authority to act in more areas, which is a political question. All of those are political questions. And so Mark shouldn't be forced to finance political activities with which he disagrees. So he brought a claim under the First Amendment and argued that that's what we call compelled speech. He's being compelled to pay for speech with which he disagrees. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court agreed to take it up.
Now that's an interesting premise. You go after essentially a commercial relationship as a free speech issue. Now, again, as a layman, explain, if you will, how did they? Was that something he had arrived at himself? Is he working with organizations who are supporting him in his legal efforts?
Oh, yeah, he sure is. And when it comes to compelled speech, so look, I mean, all of us have free speech rights. We do right now as we're talking over the internet. But we also have a right both not to speak and not to be compelled to support speech that we disagree with. Okay. And those rights are just as strong as the right we're enjoying right now. And Mark is fortunate to have representation from some very good public interest groups, including the Illinois State Policy group out there in Chicago. So he's receiving some good pro bono legal representation as he's made his fight.
Now, this had to percolate up its way up through the court system. I would imagine. How long has he been? Are you aware? How long has he actually been fighting this? Did this have to go through appeals courts and a variety of federal courts?
It had to go through federal district court and then U.S. Court of Appeals, and then the U.S. Supreme Court is what's called a discretionary court, which means it does not have to take cases; it can agree to, and in fact, it only takes less than 1% of its cases, or less than 1% of the cases that are brought to it. So the Supreme Court agreed to take this after Mark had already exhausted his other appeals.
Right, and that's exactly my point. And again, a layman here, be gentle. I believe they call it granting certiorari.
Exactly.
So there's an agenda. There's politics. All courts, particularly appointed ones, ultimately are constituted. Much conversation during the appointment process is talked about how they're constituted. Does the legal community believe that the Supreme Court, was aggressively looking to assert itself into this situation by choosing to take this case? Is this something that they had been building up to?
Yeah, I mean, in our system, the courts they're evolutionary. They're not revolutionary. And 40 years ago, it made a mistake in a case called Abood, where it said that these agency fees were fine. They said it was fine to compel somebody to turn its money over to an organization it didn't support. And sometimes the Supreme Court looks back over its precedent and sees where it makes mistakes and decides to correct them. And, we don't know how the court's going to come out in this case, but I'm hopeful, and I think broad parts of the legal community are hopeful that certainly parts of the conservative and libertarian legal community are hopeful that the court will fix something that it got wrong all those years ago.
There was people were the spinmeisters. People were agog watching the court take testimony on this. Both sides, and particularly teachers' unions and the professional union community, has got a lot at stake. I mean, this is if this changes, I would argue, and again, not an expert, I would argue that this has the opportunity, at least on a certain level, as it approaches unions, that Heller did have on gun rights. I mean, it's a signature generational case. How did people feel the questioning and the testimony went on this?
I think they thought, the question is generally at this level pretty tough on both sides, but the reports I read indicated that there's a big block of the court that is skeptical of this proposition that you can compel money from people to support groups that they disagree with. So there's a lot of questioning along those lines, and I think hopefully that's a good sign.
Do you think this is a kind of the traditional now official 5-4 ideological vote, or is there any sense that our court watchers feel like there could be a shift, that this might not be the standard breakdown? Are folks?
Well, a very similar case made its way up a few years back called Friedrichs, where a teacher out of California named Rebecca Friedrichs brought a very, very similar challenge to Mark's challenge. Mm-hmm. And that case ultimately was decided 4-4, which means that the lower court decision ruling against Rebecca was upheld. The only thing that changed in that case was that Justice Scalia had passed, mm-hmm. And has now been replaced by Justice Gorsuch. Mm-hmm. So if Justice Gorsuch's First Amendment jurisprudence is what it was when he was a lower court judge, there's reason to believe that he will vote very much like Justice Scalia would have in this case and would cast the tie-breaking vote. But of course, anything can happen. We don't know. Other justices could flip their votes for one reason or another. But based on what happened in Friedrichs and based on what we know of Justice Gorsuch, I think that there's reason to hope that this one will come out in favor of Mr. Janus.
And it brings up 2 points. On one hand, we all know a certain situation where a certain judge decided a fine was a tax, and that changed healthcare in the United States, permanently, and much to the chagrin of the conservative element. On the other hand, should Justice Gorsuch continue along his a long career of an ideological path, if you could put on your political hat for just a second, it's clear that during the Trump administration, that there will be another Supreme Court appointment. I don't think anyone doubts that certain members of the court are in very poor health and are elderly, and no one is even the most hardened ideologue isn't rooting for that to happen. But it's clear the handwriting's on the wall. Um, does this have the potential then to turn the next approval process nuclear, as our former president would say? You know, I mean, if Janus goes down in favor of conservative ideology, you know, is everything on the table in the eyes of the political left, and will this turn into a circus of unimaginable proportions? I mean, you know, that'll make Alito and Bork and all those look tame. What happens next?
It's tough. It's tough to speculate on that sort of thing. You know, it's possible the Senate could change parties. It's possible that this president doesn't get another appointment. But I think you are right to observe that if he does, I think people realize the stakes are quite high right now with a court that is essentially divided 5-4. Now, of course, judicial philosophy oftentimes doesn't break down into traditional conservative, liberal positions. It can, but doesn't always. So, you know, I think we would be hopeful that the president, assuming he gets another appointment, would appoint somebody in the mold of Justice Gorsuch, who has a long career of being dedicated to the text of the Constitution and to upholding and promoting individual rights. Mm-hmm. And sometimes conservatives might agree with the way that comes down. Most of the time, they probably would, but you know, in the criminal law context and in some others, I think there's reason for liberals to support a judicial philosophy like that.
Well, and there's other issues that are clearly on the horizon, and one always has to wonder, well, precedents like this set where First Amendment rights are paramount sets the stage for example, and again, I'd be fascinated to your interpretation. You've got the FOSTA legislation that's winding its way through, and I'm not sure, have you followed that at all? That's the
no, I haven't.
That's the anti-sex trafficking law, which will, and this is something I'd love to discuss with you guys when you have a chance to sort of digest this. But there's anti-sex trafficking law, or it's being labeled as, which is going to essentially potentially criminalize the communications, and not only just the actual communications, but the platform that is used to communicate on the internet for sites like Backpage, Craigslist, even Yahoo, Yelp, anything that it might involve, well, quite frankly, the dissemination of information about a sexual transaction done for money. And so, on one hand, it seems like courts have always been very careful about their treatment of these communications platforms, whether it be AOL in its earliest days or Yahoo or any of these. They've stayed away from criminalizing the content provider, whether it be a libel situation, whether it be a criminality, because they were just a venue, a communications venue. It would be like criminalizing the phone companies for someone having, conducting an illegal enterprise over the phone. Right. But now the ultra-conservative elements, which I believe have been emboldened by the Trump administration, are constantly chipping away from that. And ironically, it's coming from the alleged Party of Liberty, the Republican Party. What is, when you start to get into these court challenges on new technology, you're right. Anything literally can happen. What was the defendant, if you will, for lack of a better term, the labor unions? What is their claim to maintain this agency? On how are they defending themselves?
Really, they made two arguments, and I'd be interested to talk about how new technology impacts free speech. But they made a couple arguments. The first is they said, well, collective bargaining isn't really a political activity. All we're doing is negotiating over wages and working conditions, and that doesn't really have any political implications. So that was their first argument. And the second is that they're required to do it. Under state law in Illinois, they have to represent every employee that's part of the contract, whether the employee is a member of the union or not. Right. So to that point, I think the response is, well, let them out. If you asked to be the collective bargaining agent, they don't want to be part of the union, so let them out. Those are kind of their primary positions.
Right, and now we've had several situations. And, obviously, I'm hearkening to local issues here that you're not in touch with, but we had several situations where the pension systems, which were under the guise and under the part of the collective bargaining agreement with unions, were failing, and negotiations were had, and arrangements were made, and you had individual union members sue to be let out of the out of the class action, out of the class, if you will, and successfully sue. But what the argument here locally when they talk about Janus, though, is that okay, these guys have benefited from these wonderful these negotiations. They benefit from these, some of these incredible contracts. Where you got cost of living increases built into pensions, and the folks in the here at the coalition, we somewhat cynically refer to the real 1% as being folks who have had their benefits and lifestyles enshrined in the form of public union contracts.
Right.
So what happens on a practical level when, say, Mr. Janus, he wins, he continues to be an employee of the great state of this. And by the way, Illinois makes Rhode Island look like Utah in terms of fiscal responsibility. Illinois is truly a basket case financially. What happened on a practical level? The question comes up from folks like us. Well, what happens then? Does Mr. Janus go out and negotiate his own contracts? That seems to be the defense that takes place, at least at the street level of this agency. What's the next step?
Well, I don't think this answer would surprise anybody who's worked in the public sector for the last 100 years. But yes, I don't know about you, but when I took my job, I negotiated my own terms and conditions of employment. Mm-hmm. And of course, the employer might have policies already in place. They might already have pay scales in place. And the employee can decide whether or not it makes sense to accept employment with that employer. So I don't know why we live in a system on the government side of things where one group gets to negotiate for everybody, whether they want that person as their negotiator or not. That seems to be a real problem. So to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that these people should be free to either join a union if they like or not join a union if they like. And if they don't join a union, they should be free to negotiate whatever terms and conditions of employment is acceptable to both them and their employer, just like hundreds of millions of other people do in this country.
Just like you and I.
That's right.
In the world that I live in during the day, sales, how do we get a pay raise? We sell more. That's how we get a pay raise. Folks, if you're just joining us, we've only got him on the line for a few minutes more. But on a sunny Friday night where he lives, as opposed to here in La Prave, John Richards, of course, is with the Goldwater Institute. The Goldwater Institute routinely sends their best and brightest out to the coalition and really gives a provocative look at liberty issues. Sometimes really, as we say here in New England, ham and egger issues on things that affect our daily lives and opens us up to a window of possibilities that occur routinely in the real world. GoldwaterInstitute.org is the website. We provided a link for that in the show, pre-show publicity. We'll continue to provide links to that. The Goldwater Institute website is one of those websites that you need to bookmark. Rather than, as we always say, rely on national media outlets that report on someone else's reporting, who ultimately report on someone's interpretation of someone else's reporting, you can actually get real-world interpretations of big issues like this from folks who are, I'll call it literally rocket scientists of the political and government world. Now, I'll only get you for a few more minutes, but I also want to talk about, in your biography on the site, you talk about the right to earn. And I think this is all fundamental because you and your organization provide a rather provocative look at the relationship between the individual, we call it here at the coalition, the ultimate minority, the individual's rights to earn a living, and the individual's rights to earn a living within an increasingly structured, calcified, highly classified, highly licensed permission society, I think is what one of your senior people there would call it, world that we live in now. So talk about, if you can, right to earn.
So we live in a system now where almost a quarter of all jobs, a third in some states, require an occupational license before you can work in the job of your choice. And an occupational license is a government permission slip. It's the government saying, yes, go and be a plumber or a barber or a lawyer or a cosmetologist or you name it. Now, compare that to the 1950s when only about 5% of jobs required an occupational license, and almost all of those were in the medical field. The problem with this is, one, too many things are licensed. In Louisiana, you need a license to be a florist. In Maine, your neighbor right there, you need a license to be a log scaler, which I had to look up, but that's somebody who weighs logs. I'm sure that's hard work, but that requires about 800 days of training in order for the government to give you permission to be a log scaler. Compare that to EMTs in the same state, which require about 30 days of training. EMTs can cut your throat open and put an air tube in there. So I think there's the problem that just too many things are licensed. But there's another problem, and probably even a more important one. A lot of these decisions about who can get a license and who can or who has to get a license and who doesn't have to get a license, they're made by regulatory agencies, boards and commissions that aren't accountable. They're not accountable to almost anybody. Oftentimes, they're not accountable to the governor. Oftentimes, they're not accountable to the legislature or directly accountable to the legislature. And interestingly, if their decisions are challenged in court, courts review them under the lowest standard of review possible. So let me give you a quick example. If the government tried to impair your ability to put this program on by requiring a permit or a license, and you went to court and you said, hey, the government's infringing on my free speech rights for whatever reason by requiring this permit, a court would review that under what's called strict scrutiny, which means that they turn to the government and they'd say, you better have a really good reason for doing this, and whatever restriction you used, better advance that reason. Well, when it comes to occupational licensing, when it comes to economic freedom rather than free speech, the exact opposite is true. Mm-hmm. The court basically defers to all but the most crazy, all but the most irrational of government decision making. So we wrote a bill here at the Goldwater Institute that basically did a really simple thing. It said, hey, courts, when you get these cases, treat them like you do any other case. And you don't put a thumb on the scale for the government. You don't put a thumb on the scale for the regulator. You treat these like you would any other case. And of course, what we've seen now that this is law in Arizona is that you don't get more litigation, you get less irrational regulation. You allow people to work more freely in one of the most important rights that we enjoy, which is the ability to put our own labor to use as we feel that we ought to. Mm-hmm. So we're very proud of that. We hope to export it to other states, and hopefully at the end of the day, we hope that federal courts also start to take these cases seriously.
And if you could, in the few minutes that we have left with you, one of the things I emphasize whenever folks from your organization come on, we often talk about this notion that your organization creates legislation. And I kind of refer to it as sort of plug and play, portable legislation that you can break glass, add water, and download and provide to your local state legislature to provide some level of freedom. But what if you can give folks a flavor, as since you're intimately involved in this, even as someone who's in charge really of the litigation front of the Goldwater Institute. That concept, I've tried to focus on that concept here locally, is so foreign to people. It's here in Status, Rhode Island, where only good thoughts can only emanate from your legislators. They can't possibly come from somewhere else, because they have the patent on good ideas. How does that process take place? Because ultimately, if you're importing this legislation, it's got to, what's one of the oldest cliches in the book? It's got to pass constitutional muster. So how do you folks arrive at all this? It's fascinating to me. How do you make the sausage?
Well, thanks for asking. We live in a beautiful, beautiful system where our founders were so smart to not concentrate power in any one person's hands, any one entity's hands. Power's diffuse, between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And then there's yet another check where the states have their own powers through our system of federalism. And at the Goldwater Institute, we're very fortunate to work in an environment where we get to go to court and advocate for the protection of individual liberties. Mm-hmm. When we see problems in our judicial system, And when we see problems on the public policy front, we can then try and craft solutions to those and advocate for their passage at the legislature. And of course, we can take actions if we need to in the executive branch through administrative actions.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, since all power resides in the states, we're a state-based organization. We like to start with the states, and hopefully, on national issues that we address, that will also drive national change, whether it's at the federal level or whether it's through the states on state levels or on state-based issues at the national level.
And this is, to me, a critical point that I want to express to people who are either libertarians in terms of the big L, they're a libertarian background, perhaps even a liberty Republican, love that word. Change, we so often focus as a movement on change having to take place at the national level. You know, when you work and you live off the national press's concept that everything is centralized to DC, which of course we as libertarian, either big L or small l, should automatically disassociate from, because really nothing should emanate from DC. It should all be fundamentally state-based. So the genius of the approach here is to simply say, okay, you know, when it necessary, there are forces that will allow us to litigate at the Supreme Court level. But real fundamental change in our society to bring back the rights of the individual, to create an environment of true liberty, needs to take place at the hyper-local or at the largest, at the state level anyway. So why not focus our resources at environments we can control, where state governments still hold a large degree of accountability to the body politic, both on a practical level as well as the notion of responsibility, as opposed to the federal government, which is hopelessly bloated, almost legalistically immune from the entreaties of the agreed populace. And that's why I just love what you guys do, because ultimately you're fighting a ground game that's got a much higher level of success, can leverage the successes of local activists and local elected politicians to affect real change that will essentially force the hand in Washington, and largely, in its ultimate success, someday deem Washington to be largely irrelevant, other than the original vision, which was a basic national defense, and a basic national defense, and a basic national defense. I mean, everything else is, you know, we talk about everything from the Department of Education. Everything else is a recent creation of history. Ultimately, don't we need to just dial it all back to the state and local level anyway?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think you raised a tremendously important point. When you think about it, actually, even now, with how terrible the federal government is and how bloated it is, almost all of major decisions that impact your life and my life and your viewers' lives happen at the state and local level, almost all of them. Now, of course, the federal government does have the ability to garnish our wages for purposes that you and I might not agree with oftentimes. But a lot of the most important decisions are made at the state and local level. And then you put your finger on it. Washington is in so many ways irreparably broken. I can't even get simple things done at the federal level, let alone things that are pro-liberty, pro-individual rights. So I think more and more often we have to turn to the states in order to protect our inherent, our inalienable, our inborn liberties, rather than hoping that Washington will one day fix the problem, because I think history has shown us that that's not likely to happen.
And a return to the notion that as a people, we voluntarily consent to be governed, a consent which we have the right to ultimately withdraw at any time. Whether you use it in the form of natural rights, but these are rights that we were born with, and we're seeing that now with, whether it be on the failed war on drugs, whether it be now on what's going on. And we're going to be talking later in another segment with the head of our local ACLU about these red flag laws. And, you know, let's take a second and actually consider the rights, the constitutional rights of the individuals involved, and reintroduce two words called due process back into the formula. Any one of these number of issues which have been lost, and coming back all the way back to the Janus case, a lot of that was lost because ultimately we were able to hyper-politicize a federal and state and local workforce and put them in a position where they are either fiscally accountable, nor are they accountable on any level of performance basis, because we simply have no rights right now really to control the 18-headed hydra, which is the money. And it all ultimately ties back into the money. Their ability of public unions to engage in this, my term, not yours, is this jihad against fundamental rights on literally almost every aspect of our society, and then simultaneously point out while families are crippled, businesses are crippled by the cost that are inflicted on them by this government, and then point to the need for more government because families are crippled and they need our help. It's this circular logic which has my word, crippled this country. And that's why I continue to applaud your efforts. Again, this notion of legislation, litigation, as well as deep thought, is a set of weaponry that finally allows individual rights to be weaponized, and it's wonderful to see it actually in play through organizations like yours. How can I'll always ask you, please, shameless plug. How can folks read about your organization? How can they contribute to your organization? And is there anything quickly? I know we're almost out of time here on the horizon that you're also involved in that you want to just give a shout out to.
Well, thanks for those kind words, and thanks for all you do to promote liberty and out there. And people who are interested in our work can go to our website, www.goldwaterinstitute.org. There you'll find kind of the full range of issues we work on. And on the horizon, we operate in a number of different areas: free enterprise, regulatory reform, private property rights, healthcare, education reform. I think we're going to be looking more and more at some interesting regulatory reforms and how to prevent a situation where government doesn't get to always have its thumb on the scale, whether it's taking enforcement actions against people or whether it's challenging their decisions in court, how to get it back to a system where individuals have fundamental due process rights and their fair day when government's on the other side of the coin. So I think we'll be looking at a lot of issues like that in the coming months and ahead.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. John Riches, he is the Director of National Litigation and General Counsel to the Goldwater Institute. Of course, they can be found at goldwaterinstitute.org. Please make them part of your regular reading. If you're truly interested in affecting fundamental change, bringing America to the concept of American excellence and individual rights, these are the folks who are on the front line. They deserve your attention and your support. So thank you so very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Pat. Have a great day. Have a great weekend.
You too. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. You are, in fact, listening to The Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, broadcasting live at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and, of course, coalitionradio.us, where links to this and earlier programming under Coalition 1.0, when we inherited the analog world of analog radio, can be found. Just simply click on the Facebook page, on the YouTube page to see recent videos, including last week's 3-hour marathon and conversation surrounding the rights, the challenges, and the politics of decriminalizing sex work. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. Joining us in a few minutes is going to be none other than Stephen Brown. He's the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the Rhode Island chapter. We are going to be talking about Red Flag. I'll be back in a couple of minutes to just have a general conversation. Bear with us tonight. The weather, as you know, is atrocious. If you do not have to be out, you should not be out. In my journey here from my daytime job, I saw half a dozen situations with crashed trees, crashed cars. There's a lot of flooding going on. We will survive this by tomorrow. Hopefully this will be an afterthought. There is significant power outages throughout the state. So we've got a couple of guests who are going to call in who literally have no power. So we'll be working on that and behind the scenes. But again, thanks for choosing to spend time with us this evening. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we are back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network, here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, the rain-drenched, trees down, partially without power, but it's still a great night to head downtown later on and find yourself at any one of a number of fine watering holes. Hey, listen, just as an aside, the other night there was some controversy regarding an organization that I enjoy spending time with. Larry Gilheeney does a fabulous job with an organization they call Americans for Prosperity. I hope I got that right. There's so many acronyms, so little time. But I did spend time at a great local joint called Thirsty Beaver, who stepped up when another organization decided to cave to, I think, nearly libelous hate speech about a group of young millennials who seek nothing more than raise the tide for all Rhode Islanders economically. So my hat's off to Larry Gilheeney and the organization that he represents, people like John Keith, and also to the Thirsty Beaver in Cranston for stepping up and providing a great deal of hospitality. They're over on Atwood Avenue, right off of Scenic Route 5, and beautiful, right on the Johnson-Cranston border. Take a moment and have an adult cocktail there this week and tell them that it's great that there are organizations that support free speech. Because the Coalition ultimately is an organization that represents free speech, the best thought from all sides of the aisle, whether you be progressive, libertarian, conservative. We even let you in if you're a Republican. Speaking of that, joining us around the 8 o'clock hour, again, we've had a lot of chaos surrounding guest call-in, communication abilities, things like that this evening, is going to be Representative Bob Lancia. Bob has been at the forefront, if you will, of political activism as a state representative in the last few weeks. He'll talk about the ongoing chaos surrounding 911. I'm hoping, and I'm praying actually, that folks who might be in need of emergency services are served well by 911 tonight. He'll also be talking about, well, just about everything. He's been involved in the forefront of what I call the Gang of Four, the people advocating for an Inspector General's position. He had a major press announcement and introduction of legislation this week. So he'll be joining us around the 8 o'clock hour. We're fortunate to have a number of organizations that are always willing to fill in with valuable content in independent media when, let's just say, Mother Nature intrudes. This is, of course, my Yacht Club soda break. It's been a pretty wild day. During the day, I spent a fair amount of time outdoors. I talk a lot. Nothing at a moment like this is more refreshing than a Yacht Club Cola. I used to be a big fan of one of the big cola, the guy with the polar bear. I've sworn that off now, and I drink Yacht Club soda. Natural flavors, clear spring water from a local Rhode Island source. As we like to say, it's Rhode Island's boutique soda before we even knew we needed a boutique soda. It's the official beverage of the state of Rhode Island and can be found at great restaurants statewide. I remember the first time I had a Yacht Club soda, it was in a restaurant called Phoebe's out on 114A, out right on the Seekonk East Providence border. It was a house that had been converted into a seafood restaurant. The food there was fabulous. Locally owned, locally sourced, long before we knew we needed that either. And it was at Phoebe's that I encountered a Yacht Club soda for the very first time. I got to take a swig of this. This took me about an hour and a half to make a 30-minute drive here tonight. But just delicious stuff. So if you're going to put out your best food, whether you're your own gourmet yourself, if you're going to bring food in for an event, or if simply you're going to have friends around and have a few adult beverages, whether it be mixers, whether it be actual soda, don't settle for the cheap crap in a plastic bottle that's been built at a chemical factory near you. Go for the real deal. Soda as it ought to be. Natural flavors, clear spring water, locally sourced, 100+ year history. My favorites are the cola, the sarsaparilla, the root beer. It's just all great stuff. Orange soda that doesn't taste like cheap candy. It tastes, well, like orange soda used to. And of course, one can't forget their political entrees last year, and they were kind enough at the last few minutes to incorporate a libertarian choice. So, Yacht Club soda. This week also saw, quite frankly, the latest push poll slash attempt at spin by the folks supporting the now fading into obscurity attempt, if you will, at a Pawtucket Red Sox stadium. It's astonishing the lengths these folks will go to. In this case, a known political operative who handles a lot of internal polling from the Democratic Party in the state decided to look outward and present polling options purportedly independent. I'm going to leave it up to you. You read the questions. I think the term push poll is operative here. The level of desperation, as I like to say, the stench of desperation in the air is frankly gotten embarrassing. The say anything, do anything, mean anything approach to building the stadium reached a new low a week or so ago when the mayor of Pawtucket, who, again, I still believe is fundamentally, I'm going to take the high road, a good person. Just think he's wrong. When he decided at the last minute to essentially convert this into a year-round theater, how is that wrong in so many different ways? We've got wonderful theaters here in the state, some of whom in the past did receive some level of federal or state funding to survive. We no longer need to do that. We've reached a fully evolved environment in this country where corporate sponsorships are readily available from the independent level on up to established in theaters like PPAC, like Trinity, like the GAM, later Pawtucket, the GAM, all of whom provide high level, the highest level production values in a variety of formats and a variety of styles. We no longer need to look to taxpayers to do that. The corporatization of entertainment is a process that's taken place over a number of years. And to the degree which with private corporations on their own will, of their own volition, choose to support artistic enterprises like that is highly laudable. But there's an important word here, a word that some people like to use at will, and it's choice. Those organizations sought to affiliate themselves, just as Yacht Club Soda, Beacon Shipping and Logistics, the fine folks at Air Sciences. They choose to affiliate with the coalition, and they provide the sponsorship for it. They ultimately decide to do that because it's in their decision, it's in their business interest. They are not compelled to do so by force. They are not compelled to support organizations which may agree or disagree. There are times when theater, even conventional theater, can be highly politicized, the content of which, and that's fine. Theater as practiced here in the United States today has evolved into a high art. And if political satire, political points are part of that, that's why we invented free speech. I say that loosely, of course. The notion that we would build yet another theater, while simultaneously a state-sponsored theater exists at the Twin River Gaming Complex, so that two organizations in the state could ultimately leverage the monopoly they have on a particular form of entertainment, the profits of which, and that use that to subsidize or create competition in the free market to organizations who are quite, at this point, are doing it on their own, is anathema to what we believe is fair play here in America. So I'm going to use the fairness word against folks who, well, quite frankly, think that they've got a patent on it. A copyright is probably a better term. It's just not fair. It's not fair that you would take, without our permission, the resources of the taxpayer, regardless of whether it's going to make money or it's going to pay for itself or whatever contorted financial obligation environment that you see. It's not fair. It's not fair that you use that money then to grant monopolies to organizations and that compete then with folks who've used their own sweat equity, their own risk capital to build an organization. That's not fair. So damn it, let's be fair. If the Pawtucket Red Sox want a stadium, build it yourself. I'm not interested in this notion that it's going to pay for itself. That's balderdash. At what point do, well, so let's just say the owners of Go Local Prov or any one of a number of businesses on this street say to the state, we're going to retain our taxes that we collect because that will support the business, and as a result, it will pay for itself. That's exactly what they're arguing. No, folks, you know what? Just build this stadium yourself. You've got the money, you've got the resources, the connections, you've got the product. And I still believe, even at this late date, should that happen, that the owners of the Pawtucket Red Sox will find themselves almost overnight becoming folk heroes. Because they chose to invest in the future of Rhode Island. They chose to take the high road, which was not to insert their hands into the pockets of working Rhode Islanders who face so many financial challenges right now. The cost of health care, the cost of taxes, the cost of insurance. So many financial challenges. That in the presence of a failed government, they have to pay for services that they are being taxed for concurrently and not being provided for as it's part of their compact with state and local government. So it's time to just stop it. Stop the madness. Now, as I've told folks, I don't doubt for a moment that ultimately the only resolution that will take place in this stadium will be one of twofold. The team is sold to another group of investors who choose to build their own stadium. Or, heaven forbid, the Pawtucket Red Sox decide to seek greener fields elsewhere. And that would be a shame, because they are a valuable part of the community. But no one individual organization, special interest, is so important that they get to operate at the expense of, at the cost of, to the detriment of others. So while they're important, it's great to have them. We're not talking about a school. We're not talking about a hospital. We're not talking about the handful of activities to which government should limit itself. We're not talking about police or fire or the greater defense. No, we're talking about entertainment. And that's exactly how we should consider them when calculating our relationship as a body politic to an organization like the Pawtucket Red Sox Baseball Club. So it needs to stop. I want to have this conversation before Mr. Brown joins us. The charade that took place this week with regard to Governor Raimondo's crass politicization of a national strategy cannot go unremarked. Other bigger players in the media have done probably a better job than I will. But I'll just say this once. Public tragedy, even of the worst type, should never affect public policy. The notion that these red flag laws could be essentially dropped on us by executive order without the careful consideration necessary to ensure public rights for all is atrocious. And it simply can't happen. So we're going to take a quick break right now. Again, I want to thank the folks at Yacht Club Soda. I want to thank the folks at Beacon Shipping Logistics. I want to thank the folks at Air Sciences for supporting independent media in some of the very best ways possible. Whether it be shipping your automobile, whether it be providing a health service to your home and to the environment that you live in, so it's a healthy, clean, safe home for your family? Or in the case of this, after a long day, it's just a really great bottle of pop. Take a break for a couple minutes. Hopefully we'll be able to bring Mr. Brown in, and we're going to get right back down to it. You are listening to The Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, broadcasting live here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street in the heart of the city we love. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Please follow us there. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Please follow us there. And this show and all other shows will live in perpetuity at coalitionradio.us, where we've got an email sign up, and now all of a sudden over the last month or two we've had all sorts of people signing up for the email, so we are going to try and do the newsletter thing. So folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we're right back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, as always, outrage putting free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. I want to get right down to it. Joining us on the line, dialing in some of the most atrocious weather imaginable, but as always, a liberty and civil liberty warrior is Stephen Brown. He is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Rhode Island chapter. And they issued, I believe, a timely, a provocative, yet at the same time contemplative piece this afternoon discussing the executive order issuing what's referred to as red flag laws. We're all aware of the tragedy that took place in Florida just in the past few days. Seemingly yet another step downward as school violence appears to, at least superficially, escalate around the country. People can debate whether or not it's truly on the rise. They can point out to statistics. They can point out to gun laws. They can point to a number of issues. But ultimately, there was real human tragedy that took place. And the backdrop of this, of course, is the notion that government should always be reactive. Earlier this week, Gina Raimondo issued an executive order implementing red flag laws here in the state. And I'll give a very simple layman's interpretation of it, and then I'll hand the mic over to a real expert. But ultimately, the notion that there are damaged souls amongst us who are mentally incapable of having access to firearms, and as a result, my interpretation, extra legal processes should take place to separate them from them. What we must always remember is a constitutional right, the right to bear arms. This is complex, and as I pointed out, requires, well, sober thought. contemplation, a mature approach. Stephen, welcome back to the coalition. Thank you for joining us again. You folks took the time over the last few days, in the body of work element that's available not just in the press release, but in terms of substantiation of pure data. I believe it's 14 pages of supporting information is invaluable at a time like this when, well, quite frankly, there are folks panicking. I've got to ask you, on its most superficial level, you had a terrible tragedy take place last week. Innocent children died. Government then reacts and says, we're going to remove the arms from people that we perceive to be a threat. The average person will say in that moment of tragedy, well, what's the matter with that? Why isn't that a good idea? Stephen, what's the response to the RIACLU?
Well, first, well, thank you for inviting me. I think the first reaction is there may be things that can and should be done. The ACLU is not like the NRA opposed to reasonable gun regulations in a variety of aspects, but we do have strong and independent concerns about due process and privacy when dealing with these issues, and the question is, how do you respond? And as you noted, we've done an analysis of the legislation that's been introduced. It is called this red flag legislation, the idea being that if somebody is sending out potential signals that they may be prepared to engage in violence, there should be some mechanism available to take the firearms away from them. But our concern about this legislation is that it is written extremely broadly, and I'm not sure many people appreciate just how broad the language is, and that's what concerns us. It is, despite what happened in Parkland, which of course was a terrible tragedy, this legislation goes much farther than trying to address that issue. It has some very open-ended language about who constitutes a danger for whom firearms can be taken. And it's not limited to situations where you think there's an imminent threat occurring. It's not limited to situations where a person has actually threatened to engage in some violent activity. The wording is just so broad it can ensnare a lot of people and then be subject to a court hearing where they lose access to their lawfully owned firearms for at least a year. They may be subject to a mental health evaluation against their will. They will not necessarily be entitled to appointed counsel to help them in a proceeding like this, and those sorts of due process concerns are what has led us to issue this analysis and raise concerns about the legislation.
Right. One of the things that you point out is to me, and I'm a history buff, but I'm an amateur history buff. I often point out in totalitarian societies that very often political opposition can be misconstrued as being someone not of sound mind. For folks that think this can't happen, it happens routinely around the world. I think there's a tendency sometimes to ignore the slippery slope that can exist even in a freedom-loving country like the United States because, quote unquote, it can't happen here. You point out language, overblown political rhetoric on social media. What do you mean by that? I mean, give us some examples that you think could be in danger of violating these red flag laws, which could be potentially part of protected speech.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've seen this a number of times, and you've probably read or heard of situations where somebody has said something on social media, not quite as politely as they should, and they suddenly get a visit by police, or if it involves the federal government, the Secret Service are knocking on their door. And, it's people who are saying things rashly, but not with any, real indication that they plan on engaging in some sort of violence. But but they say things impolitely and in ways that they shouldn't. But that in and of itself, even if there isn't a credible threat of violence, it could lead to the issuance of the filing of a petition against the person, who would then have to show up in court and challenge this effort to have them subject to these court orders that would have the consequences that I just talked about.
It's ironic that just literally days after the Senator Kettle controversy, where on a much more benign level, but equally serious, if you will, the state Senate attempted to create my term, and it's sort of, again, a layman's term, I call it an extra legal process, where let's invent a show, let's not consider the constitutional rights or need for due process, or, as importantly, as you point out in your release, the lifelong effects if this can have upon an individual, how they're perceived by the community, their civil rights, their ability to gain counsel. In emotionally charged times like this, on a hyper-local level, you had a senator who remains accused, not convicted, but accused of some fairly egregious behavior, not something that we as a society want to tolerate, but remains accused. And then on this grander level, we are willing to engage in this chase for people who are just, well, quite frankly, in its most logical extreme, just being obnoxious. Are we losing sight of the concept of due process here in this society, or do you think this is just a temporary hiccup?
I think there are always challenges to due process. I don't think there's anything unique about what we're seeing here in these two incidents. You're right, as you know, we did raise concerns about the way the Senate was planning to act on the Senator Kettle matter by scheduling an expulsion hearing without any rules governing how it would work. Obviously it became moot when Senator Kettle decided to resign, but we were very, very concerned that they were scheduling this expulsion hearing, and nobody really had any idea about how it would work, what sort of opportunity he would have to present a defense, we thought it was important to make note of that. And we're hoping that they dodged the bullet here when Senator Kettle resigned, but we hope they'll take this opportunity in the coming months to come up with rules so that something is in place if and when this situation arises again, so that they aren't just caught by surprise again and don't know how to proceed.
I believe Senator Jabbour might have penned an open letter requesting, if you will, the creation of said process. So at one level, there's a tendency here in Rhode Island, as probably elsewhere, to lurch from crisis du jour to the next crisis. We get beyond a certain point where at least the symptoms are gone, and we have a little bit of a collective amnesia, and we lurch on to the next crisis, not really fixing things. Interestingly enough, a really long-term approach to fixing ethics issues was in the news this week. I was involved in the organization that supported the creation and I'll call it the re-empowerment of the ethics board. But whether it be ethics issues, whether it be due process issues, whether it be how we look at people like this in society, you really can't ever just walk away from it, can you? I mean, these are all evolving issues. I mean, who would have predicted 10 or 15 years ago the notion that a threat on a computer could have the resonance that some would suggest as part of this red flag legislation, or I should say executive order, should be reacted to by the full force and weight of state criminal enforcement. Can you ever really stop analyzing these situations?
No, never. The ACLU's founder, almost 100 years ago, made the comment that no battle for civil liberties ever stays won, and it's very true. You never completely win. Issues continue to crop up. You think you've won a case, and then a public official or an agency decides to ignore it, or as you're suggesting, new issues arise. And in this instance, when you're dealing with new technology, there are new issues that have to be dealt with, and people have to figure out how to apply civil liberties principles to new technologies. So it's a never-ending battle. Unfortunately, I don't think the ACLU will ever have the opportunity to go out of business, but it is critical that we keep a constant vigilance on what our government is doing and be prepared to respond when necessary.
Speaker Mattiello has effectively green-lighted some form of red flag legislation to take place, one that ostensibly would take place through normal legislative channels. I mean, I have tremendous respect and regard for the ACLU, so I won't engage in a conversation about the political motivations for this executive order. So let's look at it on a positive level going forward. What's important to you in the legislation that I believe ultimately will be created? What safeguards are critical for Speaker Mattiello and the General Assembly to consider?
Well, I really can't put it in the form of just a couple sentences.
Right.
That's why our analysis took 14 pages.
Right.
But we do believe that there is legislation that can be drafted to address this issue, to focus on having a process that allows law enforcement to be able to take weapons away from people when there's a legitimate and credible fear that this person presents an imminent danger to others. But it does require a lot of careful crafting of the legislation, and we're hopeful that our analysis provides a guidepost for legislators if they want to try to address these issues to do so, and to come up with legislation that both protects the public, ensures public safety, while at the same time incorporating some basic due process safeguards.
Mm-hmm. Civil commitment is an issue that, particularly as the population gets older, again, technology, in this case, disease, often changes the public policy and a public approach. Civil commitment, I believe, is an area of the law which has never been more challenged because of the onset of all these hideous diseases like Alzheimer's, which seem to be unfortunately growing amongst the population. Is without ruining because we are going to promote your link to this analysis. It's critical that people take a breath and take a deep breath and read your analysis and your critique of the system. But we take the process of civil commitment in most states in this country very, very seriously. Is it fair to say that this red flag law should be held in that same sort of highly articulated legal perspective?
Well, it depends on what's going on. I mean, there is a difference between actually engaging in civil commitment, taking away a person's liberty, versus just taking away their property. I don't want to demean that, but there is a big difference if you're being locked up somewhere versus the government taking some property from you. One of the issues in this legislation is that there's the potential to do both. And one of the things we argue is that if you're going to have a court have the authority to require a person to have a mental health evaluation as part of this red flag process, without the proper safeguards in place, it's really an end run around, as you've noted, the strict laws that are in place for dealing with civil commitment proceedings. So if you want to do that, then you ought to be looking at the civil commitment law. But this bill, again, is designed to do much more. And I don't think the evidence is out there to suggest that anybody who has a mental illness is all of a sudden should be treated as suspect. And that's the conclusion that unfortunately a lot of people jump to when these things happen, and sort of stigmatize anybody with a mental illness.
Right.
That would be a mistake too.
Right. I I got your reference to the movie Minority Report. If folks haven't seen Minority Report, takes place in a future world where science and behavioral sciences have evolved to the point where allegedly violent behavior is predictive, and you essentially can pre-arrest someone. As an action movie, it was okay. It was a fairly good movie. If you're attuned to the notion of civil liberties, it was one of the more horrifying movies of that generation, because it pointed to a society which attempted to preclude any notion of actual behavioral guilt or actual intent. It just the potential was there, and that was predictive enough for folks to engage in, it ultimately lead to tension. So I thought that was a particularly apt analogy. I guess in summary, I think it's fair to say that when these hearings come up in the General Assembly, I believe you'll be a fixture in that at those hearings. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, we do expect to testify. Yep.
Okay, that's great. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on this rainy night. How can and we'll we do our bit. We try to publicize whatever we can. How can folks read this? How can folks contribute to the ACLU here in Rhode Island directly as you guys continue to play such a seminal role in our body politics? How can folks get a hold of you?
Well, people can go to our website, which is www.riaclu.org. And from there, you'll be able to find information about this particular issue. You can join, you can donate. We make it very easy for people who want to do that, to be able to do so directly from our website. All of our work is funded by private donations and membership. So we certainly encourage anybody who supports what we're doing to help us in that way. Excellent.
A few years ago, you spent some time with me on the radio. We spent an hour talking about the history, and we called it "Why You Should Join the ACLU." It's in weeks like this, after moments like last week, that we replay that interview. We tied it into the pre-show publicity of your attendance because, well, it really hasn't changed. It's the issue, as you pointed out, the challenges are timeless, and we hope you folks continue to be the force you are in protecting really all perspectives in society. And again, I'm thrilled that you came out with this. We are going to be reaching out, by the way, folks, to the National ACLU to talk about FOSTA. It's an issue we covered last week. We'll get more into that in the next session. But Stephen, again, thank you so much for joining us on a really rainy, terrible evening.
Thank you, Pat. Take care.
All right. Folks, Stephen Brown, the Executive Director of your Rhode Island American Civil Liberties Union. What's the takeaway from this conversation? First of all, you need to join the ACLU. I prefer to have this element of the conversation after Mr. Brown is off because I refuse to politicize his work because it is noble. It is largely apolitical, despite how certain sides may feel about it at any one given moment. There's a tendency to villainize the ACLU depending on which side of the issue you are on, what your perspective is on an individual event like this, to which I would say is a rather simplistic response. If at some point they're pissing off everybody, they're probably doing their job. A writer who I allude to constantly on the show, who had a tremendous impact on my life, is a gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff, who passed away this past year. He was a civil liberties writer and jazz columnist, if you will, for the Village Voice of New York City. An amazing author. He penned a tome called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee. And he too was famous for, well, pretty much everybody was mad at him at one point. But ultimately, if character is doing the right thing when no one is watching, then protecting your civil liberties when it's the least convenient, the most challenging, the most emotional moments, that's when it's the most important. We live in a world of various shades of grays. There are no blacks and whites. Every issue, every response has got its own unintended consequences. As we react to horrific tragedies like what happened in Parkland, if we were to simultaneously do so in a manner which is to abridge the rights of the few, then ultimately we sacrifice the rights of many. We do not dishonor the victims of Parkland by asking people to take a pause, to take a moment's break, and reflect on the tragedy, the root causes, and the potential impact of how we react to it. We do not do them dishonor. We recognize that those lives were grotesquely short in a manner no parent should ever have to endure. But, and here's the but, we need to take that collective deep breath. We need to look at all of the issues as they surround society. We need to question leaders who would quickly attempt to politicize these events, who grandstand, who lead the march for their own personal purposes, who create false tropes about their family, and what their motivation was for, and the chain of events that led up to their motivation. We need to do that on both sides. There is no right or wrong on this, regardless of whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. When it comes to fundamental liberties, liberties that I as a libertarian believe that I was born with, and that all of you are born with, we cannot let tragedy, even the most deeply felt tragedies, impact those long-term liberties. We're going to take a little bit of a break right now. Again, it's a challenging evening here in Rhode Island. Terrible weather outside. It's a good night to stay at home. Grab a yacht club. By the way, available at restaurants and dining institutions across the state. Also available at Eastside Marketplace. Read a book. Hopefully you've got power. I just found out I don't. But stay safe. Folks, this is the Coalition Loud and Proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live in the Worldwide Coalition Media Headquarters. It's the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, deeply in the heart of the city we so love, Providence, Rhode Island, the Naked City. We've told a few stories tonight. Bob Lancia is hopefully going to join us in just a few minutes by phone. We'll talk about, ironically, on a night like today, when our brave first responders, the men and women of our fire departments, are out there in just difficult circumstances. Trained professionals. We're going to talk about 911. That's been in the news the last week or so. We'll revisit his Inspector General legislation, see where that is. They had a major announcement on that this week. And as usual, we'll talk about government in general. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we are back. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. 90 Way Boston Street. It's a terrible night weather-wise. A significant part of the state, I don't have numbers, but there are a significant amount of power outages. Trees are down. Normally I kid about this, but tonight's no kidding matter. Stay home. Enjoy the comfort of your family. If you're listening to this show live, again, I'll spare you my rendition of There's Got to Be a Morning After, but I have a feeling by tomorrow we'll be just fine. So tomorrow night, take an opportunity, come into the capital city, and enjoy an evening here amongst our local independent business people. It's been quite a show. The Goldwater Institute talking about an incredible moment of time in our nation's jurisprudence when we talk about the notion of forced public union membership and the free speech implications. Stephen Brown from the American Civil Liberties Union, and possibly, in terms of personal tragedy, at one of the most difficult crossroads in our recent nation's history, as we weigh the rights of the individual, rights that the individual were born with, their constitutional rights, and how to react to incredible tragedy. Cooler heads can prevail. Equally at a crossroads is our great state of Rhode Island. Joining me on the line, it was nice enough to call in. It was been a kind of a chaotic night. So many of our scheduled guests were without power, but it was very important that we make time for Bob Lancia anyway. Bob has been really at the forefront of two incredibly important issues within the last few weeks. One, that he had, as a member of a gang of legislators, the Gang of Four, the Gang of Five, had come together preemptively, if you will, to take an approach to address, let's just say, the challenges that face the Rhode Island government. When you're in a position like Bob's, other issues just sometimes voice themselves upon you. And the work he's done in the past few weeks, starting out innocently enough, if you will, with studying the scoops that take place out of government budgets, and how money, my words, not my guess, are misappropriated in an act of government malfeasance that I consider contemptible, led him, if you will, to a discovery that, ironically tonight, one hopes doesn't have negative consequences, as we are in the middle, somewhat depending on where you are in the state, in a weather emergency. So joining me on the line, he's a repeat offender here on the Coalition, is Bob Lancia. He is your state representative from, let's see if I get it right, Bob, District 16?
That is correct.
I got it right finally. Bob, it's a challenging evening out there. First of all, how's your district doing weather-wise? What's going on out there?
Well, like everyone else, did a little drive around a little earlier, and some of the businesses do not have power. Some of the homes do not have power. There are, driving around some of the main streets, there are some tree limbs down, and they're trying to address that and stay on top of it. I heard Mayor Fung on the news earlier, and they're trying to stay on top of this with our Public Works Department. And as I watch the weather and the news, I'm one of those few lucky ones that still has power. But they're talking about, of course, the winds. And until they go below, I guess, below 40 miles an hour, which apparently is not going to happen till tomorrow morning, the guys and gals can't get up in those bucket trucks because of the wind. So it looks like it's going to be an early morning event before they can start doing repairs and getting people back with their power.
Right. And I think in tonight's conversation, we're going to talk about first responders. I think we have to take a moment and pause and reflect on the folks in those bucket trucks, the folks who, whether it be, the warriors, if you will, the hidden warriors at, Department of Public Works, towns across Rhode Island, whether it be the folks who work for the phone company, the power company in particular, and the gas company, who are out in, quite frankly, life-threatening circumstances acting, leaving their family behind, often without power, to work on our behalf. And yes, it's a job, but I would argue, Bob, that's actually, for most of the folks that I met to do that, it's actually a calling. We need to consider them in our thoughts when we talk about first responders as well, because quite frankly, they operate at some of the highest risk imaginable. So that brings us, actually, we kind of flip the challenges around, if you will. Because of the weather, I'm hoping, and I know you are too, that the 911 system, after a night like tonight, and I don't want to make this sound like it's, a situation a la Puerto Rico or a situation a la Houston, but it's a difficult night, one in which people's lives are going to be challenged. Live power lines, class 1 hurricane-like winds. We're going to experience all that tonight. Give us your background. I was going to give us your background on the 911 system.
So, it's so interesting too. We heard about one man, in Newport this evening, a tree broke off and a tree limb and killed him. Talk about needing emergency services. So absolutely, it is a tough night out there for those people working and those people who are out there just trying to live their lives.
Mm-hmm. So give us again a snapshot on, you were here with us just about a month or so ago. And at that point in time, the conversation was still somewhat focused on the appropriate, it was really an outgrowth of the Inspector General's conversation, if you will, and that was discussing the appropriateness of these scoops where money is taken from different budgets. And you mentioned, I don't want to say anecdotally, but as an aside, you mentioned that, okay, it's becoming clear to you that money was being, my word, not yours, misappropriated from the 911 budget. What's happened since then?
Well, thank you for asking. A lot's happened, actually. In fact, last night, I watched Katie Davis, investigative reporter from Channel 10, who's been working with me over the last couple of years on this story, and she was visiting up to the 911 center, and we finally got some numbers because I did hand deliver a letter to the governor asking for a meeting regarding actually two issues. One, a meeting regarding the 911 situation, and a second letter regarding the homeless situation. So I didn't get to meet with the governor, but I did get to meet with two of the governor's people on the 911, and I'm waiting for the meeting on the homeless situation with some of my local advocates that I work with. But during that meeting, one of the questions I asked was, what is the minimum manning? And so I was told at the time that there was no minimum manning. Well, last night, Katie Davis, for the first time, got some numbers. There were supposed to be, or is supposed to be, 47 people at the 911 center. Now, we have been saying right along that they've been down anywhere from 10 to 12. Well, last night we got evidence of that because she reported that they had 47 positions, but only 37 people hired. And of the people that were hired, of course, we had a couple people the week before that went out on stress-related leave. They had to go out, heart-related stress. We had another person was out due to a back injury. And then she was saying a week ago that they were hiring 4 new people. And again, according to last night, we needed 10. So she hired 4. And what happened was the first one of the 4 quit in the 3rd day. So, again, we were down. We had other people out, so they were really below the numbers they needed. But Katie Davis also reported last night that the governor's office finally gave approval to hire the 10 people needed to get the number up to 47. Also, she reported that one of the hallmarks of all of this is that they exhausted the overtime budget of $170,000 because, again, they're short people and they've got to pay overtime to those that are still left there. These people are overworked, they're under stress, and in fact, when I did interviews with Tara Granahan and also Gene Valicenti, one of the questions Gene Valicenti asked me, and it's something you just mentioned just a few moments ago. He said, there's this impression of state employees, lots of times. And I said to him at the time, I said, these are dedicated individuals who care, and they are working hard, but they are, again, stressed out, overworked. And the other point I made is it takes 4 to 6 months to train one of these people. And, so you bring people aboard, 10 people, they're not really going to be ready to go, for a few months. And the other thing is, the salaries they pay these people, the starting wage is only 16 and change an hour, and these are people that have to be trained for 4 to 6 months. This isn't like, this talk about, obviously continuing to raise the minimum wage, but a minimum wage worker making $15 versus a trained professional, 4 to 6 months of training, making only 16 and change. What kind of people do you think you're going to get that want to go into a situation that is high stress? I give these folks all the credit. But the other thing I learned too, this has been exciting actually. I had a gentleman from Washington call. His name is Adam Bender, and he has a newsletter, an Insights newsletter, and he had written about the 911 situation, and he called me up to interview me. And when he interviewed me, he did the story, he wrote it, and what came of that is that members of the FCC called to my office asking about what's going on, because there was a great editorial in the Providence Journal, and two of these FCC commissioners, Michael O'Reilly and Jessica Rosenwalsel, said that states are stealing funds from 911 emergency service, and they suggested that they would be punished. And how they would be punished is that they would have a loss of federal dollars that would help pay for 911 upgrades. So during the meeting with the governor's people, because I had this editorial in front of me, I said, what has the punishment been? What has the punishment been for the state as far as loss of 911 upgrade funds? And they couldn't tell me. They said they'd get back to me. So, a lot like, with the UHIP where we were fined $900,000, right? Here, we had a loss of 911 upgrade funds. But, again, I think Katie Davis mentioned that the amount we had collected this past year was not $15 million, but $17 million. And of that, again, 911 ceased to exist as a separate entity in 2009. It falls under the purview of the public safety, under the head of the state police. It really only cost $5.4 million to run 911 if you costed it out as a separate entity. But what I also learned this past week is that $800,000 to $1 million is paid to a company called AK Associates. AK Associates' job is just to make sure that everything keeps running up there. So you can deduct $800,000 to $1 million off of the 911 budget, because that's paying not for the actual folks working. But so much has happened. And finally, to try to push this a little further, I've been reached out by the head of the Rhode Island Police Officers Association, as well as Steve DeToy from the Rhode Island Medical Society. They're interested in what I'm doing because they have some other things that they feel they can contribute to help make 911 a better system and be more helpful, even more helpful to people that are trying to access those services. So what I did is I said on Tara Grenihan I was going to call a summit, and I am calling a summit. I'm going to try to get all the providers from the emergency response centers for each city and town to the Cranston Central Public Library on Monday, March 19th from 6 to 8 p.m., and we are going to talk about the needs of the communities, what's happening, have the medical society in, have the police chiefs head in to talk about some things, exciting things that they have in mind for 911, and also to try to get that money allocated where it belongs. And maybe we'll even get an answer to what's happened as far as the state losing possible 911 upgrade funds. So it's exciting. And I also learned this evening, this was very exciting, it is a bad night tonight. They actually are staffing this evening. Normally they only staff, originally it was 8 people at night. They said it could be 4 or 5 now. They had dropped the number. But you know how many people they got on tonight? 11. So they're hearing us and they're reacting. And I'm very excited about that.
By the way, Steve DeToy has been on the coalition when we last year when a legislation passed to allow for warrantless search of the prescription medical database program. The Rhode Island Medical Society is one of the oldest in the nation and has got a tremendous history. A quiet organization that most folks have never had to deal with. but it's just a wonderful organization. So let's step back for a couple seconds. First of all, you know, there's a sense, and you're right. Katie's done yeoman's work working with you in reporting on this. I mean, real gritty, you know, old school style reporting, which is sadly, it's tougher and tougher to find these days.
Yep.
The notion of quick response is so fundamental to today's medicine. They're inseparable. And think of something like heart attacks and strokes, where literally seconds, a minute or two, can dictate really the future of an individual's life. I mean, whether A, they survive, B, if there's any quality of life left, depending on the severity of the heart attack or stroke. And then C, almost as an afterthought, because I don't want to put money and human lives on the same level, but quite unfortunately, the cost of the healthcare system. So at its most fundamental level, the failure of this administration, and probably previous, but particularly this administration, to provide the level of support necessary to successfully operate the 911 system reaches across economic boundaries. It reaches across. It's a fundamental human issue that has broad-reaching impact to the tune of a couple of $1 million, which, by the way, is actually being collected for its behalf. I consider that fraud, malfeasance. You know, if it could be proven in any cases that folks either died or, again, the severity of the complications of the medical situation they suffered from, hell hath no fury. It's such a fundamentally human issue that in order to fund an out-of-control, bloated, self-absorbed, self-aggrandizing, self-interested, narcissistic government organization, government bodies, which is what we have in place in Rhode Island today, that they would knowingly put lives at risk is, in a life filled with outrages, possibly one of the most despicable things I've ever heard in Rhode Island. Then, let's take it to the next level. The people who work there. Bob, you and I are old enough to remember the air traffic controller strike.
Mm-hmm.
There were, in any situation like that, there's good and bad that comes of it. One of the good things that came of it was a recognition of the very bad, which was the stress levels that air traffic controllers face as part of their day-to-day lives. Before then, I don't think anyone had an idea, unless you had someone in your family. Just the horrific stress. So I think there's a tendency, and this is not a shot at telemarketing people. I think there's a tendency for the average person, myself included, to think of folks who, well, first of all, if we even think, shame on me, if we even think of these folks who work at these centers, if we're even cognizant of them, to perhaps in our naivete or our self-absorption, accord to them a role not unlike the happy, cheery person at Time Life Books answering the phone for, you know, the greatest hits of the 1950s. You couldn't be further from the point. These are folks who are, if as difficult as life is as a first responder, these are folks, you know, the average first responder, how many calls do they make a night? Tough stuff. They're right there. They're right in the heart of it. These are individuals who are first responders their entire shift.
Mm-hmm.
Call after call after call after call after call. You call 911. Yes, we understand. We've heard all the stupid calls for pizza and the people complaining about their weed or something. But by and large, the phone calls they're getting are life-altering, they're dramatic, and these individuals find themselves on a nightly basis in the center of continual human tragedy. Gunshots, heart attacks, loved ones, lost children. I mean, my God, I don't know how these people do it.
I agree.
And so to not pay them a reasonable salary, to put them in positions where and nursing faces a lot of the same challenges in a different way, where we put people in positions where they're undermanned, they're understaffed, they're undertrained, they're underpaid, and then expect them to routinely perform at a heroic level. It's just disgusting.
I agree.
I agree. And if we didn't have the money, and if it was a question of choosing resources between this and education and but we have the money. The money is collected. The money is stolen. People in this state need to start looking upon this as a theft of services. Money was collected for a particular process. It has been stolen from that process. And it has been stolen from a role fundamental to the safety of every one of our family members. So people shouldn't just sit back and say, damn politicians are moving the money. What they need to do, everyone needs to do is, at one time during this controversy, take a look around their dinner table and understand that at any one time, God forbid, and I mean it, God forbid, at any one time on a night like tonight, one of their family members could be waiting on a 911 call that, not because of the people who work there, but because of the people who run this state have decided that it is a higher priority to fund state house services or whatever, or a baseball stadium or any one of these atrocities that they do, and they do it potentially at the expense of a loved one in their family. Am I being over dramatic?
No, I can't disagree with you. And in fact, we talk about stress. My wife previously worked for the Rhode Island Tax Division. She was there 39 and a half years. So I watched firsthand, when we talk about people and functioning and the stress level and caseloads, and now we see it at DCYF, we see it at the Department of Human Services, the registry. It's just, and I remember Governor Chafee when he first got elected, and I give him credit for this. He went to each department to talk to the people, check in with them. But, I think, going forward in the future, I think any governor worth his or her salt needs to be on a regular basis going into these different agencies and finding out what exactly is going on, talk to the people that work there, let them know that, that they care and that they're going to do everything they can to make sure these places are running the way they're supposed to be, that they're adequately funded, and that the people working there who are professionals will be cared about. And I think that's a real failing. If I was governor, that's what I would be doing. And, when I put in my second bill, which was the Inspector General bill, which, again, we had a press conference yesterday about, and working again with Ray, and I know you've had him on, Ray Beberick from Middletown, former Army Inspector General, retired, and a gentleman responsible for getting the 10-cent tolls off the Secundit River Bridge. To have an opportunity to work with a gentleman like him on the Inspector General bill has been, again, for me, I just feel blessed and honored to work with this gentleman. But, he opened my eyes to, just looking at the budget as compared to other states. We've Pat? We've doubled our budget from $4.8 billion to $9.4 billion in just 10 years. New Hampshire's only $5.7 billion, Maine $7.1, Delaware $4.1, a state of 900,000+ people on $9.4 billion budget. Where is it going? And during our press conference yesterday, Mr. Barabec said something that really caught my attention. He said nationally, the state tax bite per resident nationally is $6,700. Mm-hmm. In Rhode Island, it's $8,700. And he said if you take that $2,000, you multiply it by 1 million people, he says you come up with $2 billion. Crazy. We've got to start looking at every efficiency, every department. I think, that government is way, way out of control for a state this size. And it just doesn't make sense. And we need somebody to go in and begin to work on it. But also, our next governor has to be prepared to start doing that. And I think I related the story. A very public official, he came up to me at a function and he said, Representative Lancia, I got to tell you, I love, what you're doing with the Inspector General bill. He said, it's amazing. He said, can't we just get a white sheet of paper? He said, and just start writing down. Just let's start over. What do we need? What functions does government really have to perform? He says, just start with a white paper. Let's start over.
Right.
And really, in a sense, we've got to look at reinventing, how we do government.
Right.
I just don't see any option because we can't continue like this. I talk to people all the time working 2, 3 jobs, property taxes off the charts, and one of my senator friends from Delaware, he made a statement. He said, people from Delaware, are you getting the services that you're paying for? Are you getting the bang for the buck? And that's a question that I'm going to ask in my campaign going forward. Rhode Islanders, my fellow Rhode Islanders, are you getting the services? Are you getting the bang for the buck? And 99%, I think, are going to say no. And we've got to change that. And so this is why this election coming up, I think, is a seminal moment in the history of Rhode Island. I mean, we've got to begin to bring some different players to the State House. You can't expect different results with the same players. And so, and this, I think, yourself, we've got to bring some new people, new ideas, new dynamics to the State House because we've got to change this. We cannot do business as usual. People can't afford it. People can't afford it.
Now, the notion that somehow that the people who brought us to this point are going to have a deathbed conversion to, just fund. I used to say fiscal sanity. I'm just saying fundamental sanity at this point is insane. I had the opportunity a few months ago to sit across from the table in the Dan York State of Mind, Tony Pires, and at one point he pointed out in a rather interesting moment of revisionist history that the libertarian movement, if you will, could only exist in an agrarian society. And at which point I looked at him, I said, something effective, you understand that and he pointed out his 17 years in the State House. I said, you understand that you almost personally are responsible for the state of Rhode Island in the mess that it's in right now. So you're absolutely right. It's I think there was a great line in a Jack Nicholson flick, and it starts out with "This town needs," and I'll let each individual listener sort of fill in the gap. I want to take a quick second right now. I want to thank our sponsors again tonight. Beacon Shipping and Logistics. You hear me talk about them every week. They've been with us since the beginning. Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. Folks, if you own an automobile, if you just bought an automobile online, if Susie is taking out to college grandma's old Dodge Dart, or the family minivan is going to have a new life somewhere, and another family member's, Beacon Shipping and Logistics. Imagine, if you will, a shipper with international reach based right here in Warwick, Rhode Island. They provide shipping services for dealerships around the country. There's another customer of mine who uses Beacon Shipping and Logistics. They make state-of-the-art new energy transmission systems for vehicles. They use Beacon Shipping and Logistics to transfer to their the trucks that they use for experimentation, their engineering trucks, to bring them out to facilities in California, to Detroit, to all the different automobile shows about the country. They don't even shop anymore. They just call Eric at 1-855-3-SHIPPING, beaconshippingandlogistics.com. Again, whether it be Air Sciences, Beacon Shipping Logistics, Yacht Club Soda, we'll have another announcement next week. Folks who support independent media are doing it to support political thought and to help build the community. As legacy media collapses around us, literally, or gets hired by Gina Raimondo, the need for independent media has never been more intense. And there are so many different independent media outlets across the state. So take a moment and support the advertisers and the sponsors who support them. You're not having an hour-long conversation with thought leaders like Bob Lancia on a Friday night with the opportunity commercial-free to get intimately involved in all of these issues if it's not from Indie Media. We're not talking about Supreme Court rulings in a commercial-free process with folks from some of the smartest think tanks in America. Steve Brown gets on and is able to elaborate on one of the most serious challenges facing Rhode Island at this very moment from a civil liberties perspective, and he's able to do it in a manner that's uninterrupted, that is really the best of Stephen Brown. Thoughtful, a unique perspective, and a focus on the real issues that simply doesn't exist in 30-second drive-by television. Without all of the variety of independent media outlets in this state, whether it be Rhode Island Free Radio, Steve Alquist's new project, Motif, good friend Russ, he's got a project, Go Local Proud from Who Studios I Broadcast, and of course the coalition. I believe we would be in a far poorer spot in this state. Joining me again on the line is Representative Bob Lancia, he of District 16, the city of Cranston, involved in seemingly an exploding range of issues. He is right now Johnny on the spot. We started talking about, again, an issue pretty fundamental to tonight's activities. The 911 system, overburdened, scooped, I'll use my word, stolen from, ripped off, robbed, to the benefit of a general fund. Who knows where that money being spent? We couldn't even follow the trail. Which leads us into the issue we're talking about right now, which is, of course, the Inspector General's issue. White hot. As we see government largesse gone wild, government expenditures gone wild. Today, by the way, or actually I should say yesterday, an important day in the month of too many Rhode Islanders, it being the first day of the month. And the first day of the month implies the receipt of public benefits. I'm not here to critique or criticize anyone who receives public benefits. What I am, however, here to critique is an organization, our state, which is so woefully incompetent at delivering public benefits to the point where, quite frankly, they continue to put individuals in harm's way. So UHIP ties, I believe, very neatly into the issue right now we were discussing, which is the Inspector General position. Now, postulate, if you will, a second, Bob, and thanks again for joining us tonight. The term, if you're a wrestling fan, I think the term steel cage death match comes to mind. Imagine putting into one steel cage UHIP and somebody like Ray Burberg. Who comes out alive? Ray, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to, is one of the most polite, genial, understated, tough as nails SOB that I've met in my lifetime. I ain't getting in that cage alone with him. That's all I know. But is UHIP potentially, what do they say in the military, Bob? You're a veteran, a target-rich environment for an Inspector General?
Really. One of the things I did yesterday at the press conference, we talked about, the things that an Inspector General could do or help with. But I said, let's bring this down to a human level. I said, because really that's what we need to do. We need to humanize this situation. So I talked about the fact that last year we had a $60 million deficit. And to help balance the budget, the government obviously went in and scooped from various accounts. But for me, one of the most egregious was the Energy Efficiency Fund. Mm-hmm. She scooped $12.7 million from the Energy Efficiency Fund. That's that charge that's on our electric bills. It's supposed to pay, to help insulate homes and businesses and these kinds of things, and use that to balance the budget. And she took $1 million from Rhode Island housing. Again, we have a housing problem here in Rhode Island. We need more affordable housing. We need, places for people to live. And this year, she is going to go in and scoop $5 million from Rhode Island Housing. And I said, this is the kind of stuff that's going to stop. This is, the Inspector General, hopefully can, generate, some revenue by looking for waste, fraud, and abuse and efficiencies. Because, we have these fundamental needs. And, these accounts are being rated, to balance a budget that I think is yes, bloated. So, I try to bring it down to a human level. I drive down Promenade Street many mornings, and there's homeless people living under the bridge at the backside of the mall. And when I had my bill for the sex offenders at Harrington Hall in Cranston, my bill, I'm a Republican, so my bill passed the House, a bit of a bruising debate, but then it went over to the Senate, and it kind of just laid there. And then my opposite, my Senate colleague, Senator Gallo, put in a bill, and her bill passed the Senate and came over to the House, which had ultimately passed there as well. My bill didn't pass. One of the things that my bill would have done is give a 6-month window, because this has been going on for years with the Harrington Hall in my district, the place of last resort for sex offenders and homeless folks as well. But the 6 months was supposed to, I wanted to see, and you and I talked about this, bringing all the players together that, work with the homeless and those in need, both the nonprofits that raise their own funds as well as those that get paid. And what I wanted to know is, I wanted to bring everybody together and say, okay, what agencies are we giving money to? How are they using the money? Is it 97% for administration, 3% for services? What is it? We're sending people out onto the streets, 7 o'clock in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, on nights like this. Right. Days like this, and can we do a better job? Of course we can, but it takes will and it takes work, and we need to bring these people together. So that's one of the letters I did deliver to the governor, that we wanted to have a meeting about this. We wanted to get the figures, get the numbers, who are the players, and so this is the kind of thing. And so we look at last year, DCYF. We had 24 children die in DCYF custody. And meanwhile, they hired 35 administrators for $100,000 each when they needed 119 workers. Well, after this crisis, 4 children, and it was the time I was doing my sex offender, going from school to school with having hearings, 4 died over a weekend. And then the governor emergency hired 70 social workers, but she still needed 119. But we had 35 administrators. And I understand from my Senate Minority Leader, I think she shared with an individual, that the governor has hired, I don't know, maybe 89 people or something, $100,000 to $200,000 each, might be like $11 million. Prior to that, Governor Chafee previously had a semi-freeze on at the end of his administration, and that all went out the window when the new governor came on board. And, again, hiring, they joke about on the radio all the time, but it's not really funny, but talk about how many PR people that the governor has hired. Right. So these kinds of things, the children dying in custody. In fact, in yesterday's paper, I think it was, or today's paper, let me see, is it today's? It was today's paper. Front page, talking about a group home called A Criminal Enterprise by a Rhode Island lawmaker. And that would be Chairwoman Patricia Serpa from West Warwick. She heads the Oversight Committee. She's been on this issue with DCYF as well as UHIP. I mean, she's been doing a phenomenal job. But we've got a group home, a couple of group homes, where literally using a van for inappropriate purposes and using children for inappropriate purposes. And this place is still receiving state funds. And they said, shut it down. Right. And it's still operating. This is the kind of stuff that just drives people crazy. We should be, protecting. This is the state's job, to protect the most vulnerable. And I think when you fail in that task, you're failing as the most fundamental part that government can play, protecting the most vulnerable. So, this kind of stuff has got to stop.
It's amazing how it all is intimately tied into each other.
Yes, it is.
It starts out with a wrong-headed approach, perhaps innocently enough, that government can do this, government can do that, government can do this. And yet, when you look across the board, and this is where folks like us are called negative. By the way, someone calling me negative at the point is their last offense. That's an admission that they've lost control.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. At this point in time, given everything that's happening, do you think this governor has lost control?
I don't know if it's lost control or not really tried to take control. Allowing things to operate, around, and it seems that it takes a crisis or pressure has to be brought to bear to bring about many times needed changes, where I think a more proactive, again, such as Governor Chafee did when he first got elected, going into these departments, finding out what's going on, finding out what the needs are, and then getting those results, getting those needs met, so that things run the way they need to run. But this is, I think, unfortunately, I think this is how it's been going along. And last year we had a $60 million deficit. We've been underfunding DCF year after year. Last year we underfunded by $7 million. Yet we could find $700,000 to hire 3 new politically connected magistrates.
I want to let that hang out there for a second. By the way, the management types have a very sophisticated term for the type of management behavior that you're discussing. You know what they call it? Management by walking around. Literally. Management by walking around. Management by walking around means you don't sneak around. You just simply show up in different places in unplanned moments where you're least expected, and just not interfere, but just simply observe, be a presence. Accomplishes 2 issues. You become aware of issues that were being hidden, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. But also the notion that if you have any level of authority or control over the situation, the notion that you could, in fact, be walking around at any given moment ramps up the pressure on people to perform, because they don't want to be that guy or that gal who's in the middle of a meltdown when you happen to walk around that office.
Yep.
The constant complaint I hear, both through media and through my own sources, is that we have an imperial governorship. That we have a governor who is completely top down, who is hopelessly out of touch with the exception perhaps the much vaunted Commerce Corporation,
mm-hmm.
which has become completely politicized. The state police, which is at a high level, has become completely politicized. Watching the state police being trotted around during the red flag parade, demonstration had to be particularly ennobling for folks who are familiar with the long, proud history of the Rhode Island State Police. But we have a governor who is, sitting on high, looking down and moving chess pieces, not managing.
It is really frustrating as a legislator, at least for this legislator, to see so much that's going on, so much that needs to be changed, addressed, to know that hardworking Rhode Islanders are, having so much taken out of their paychecks every week to run this government, and they are not getting the results, they are not getting the bang for the buck. And it breaks my heart when I see somebody working at a McDonald's or a Walmart who are trying to make ends meet, might be working 2 or 3 jobs just to meet their obligations, and to have this money being deducted from their pay, it just breaks my heart, because I see how so hard so many of them work, and they're relying on people like me to be there with no personal agenda, just to do the right thing, to be their representative, to make sure that we are running efficiently, that we are spending the money, the way any household would run. And Representative Walsh, she was one of the gang of five, as you say.
Yeah.
Representative Walsh, Representative Shanley from Warwick, Representative Walsh from Providence, Representative Mendonça from Middletown, and Representative Vella Wilkinson from Warwick. We all, got together. We're from different, political perspectives slightly, but we all agree on this. And we all saw a need, and they're 4 freshmen. I'm only a second termer, but to come together, as kind of the new kids on the block, really, and see this and be willing and able to work together. I just say, why can't government work like this? So I've been very proud to work with the group of them, and hope to maybe work on some other initiatives with them. But this is it's just so egregious. It's hard. It's hard to sit there, and so I'm going for it, because you've got to. I mean, the people expect us to do the right thing. They expect us to do what needs to be done, and that's my goal every day. And I get out there, and I'm at all kinds of different events. I'm in the various ethnic communities. My wife is by my side. You go to Universal Studios. You got those T-shirts you can get, thing 1, thing 2, thing 3. People are starting to call me Rep 1 and calling my wife Rep 2. So I said, I got to get some T-shirts made. She's by my side, and she sees the same thing I see. But there's need out there. And on that sex offender bill, after it finally got passed, you talked about Stephen Brown, so a great segue. But the ACLU filed suit to, we had put it in to limit the number to 10% at any state-funded facility. The problem was that the state was not prepared. They didn't take that 6 months, or it was shortened because we had that session that went longer, but they didn't take that time to bring the plays together, as you and I talked about once before, and make accommodation so we wouldn't have to have a lawsuit from the ACLU. So now they're going to look at maybe, to get to find services and housing for, the sex offenders, but now you've still got your homeless. And who need help as well. So again, I see it as a total picture, and we've got to work together to solve this. And that's the problem. No one's working together. Everyone's in their own little silos, taking care of their own little whatever they think is important, or what their need is. A lot of times, people in authority. And I take it as a totally different view. You've got to bring the players together. We don't always need to pass laws. We don't always need to have study commissions. Just people sitting around a table and working this stuff out. And that's what we were calling for on that. So I can understand in that sense why Stephen Brown would have filed a suit, because this should have been handled differently. You can't kick people out on the street at 7 o'clock in the morning, let them out in all kinds of weather, no programs, no help, no services. We need more affordable housing. We need better opportunities, and they're just not there. And we've got to do a better job as a state. We've got to become more friendly. Businesses have got to look at us as a place to come and do business. And we have a lot of things we need to work on: our electric costs, our taxes, our regulations. There's so much we need to work on. But I think it's just going to take a different perspective, and hopefully, there's going to be some. Hopefully, this election cycle this fall, there's going to be hopefully some new folks, and maybe maybe a new chief executive.
Now, let's look at the legislation for the IG, Inspector General. So, right now, you had your press announcement. So you have specific legislation in the pipeline now.
Yes.
All right. That's for the General Assembly? Is there corresponding legislation in the Senate?
I had talked to the minority leader, our minority leader, Dennis Algier, and he was going to put in the companion legislation.
Okay. And so are you right now, are the 5 of you the current sponsors? Are you getting traction? Are other legislators kind of dipping their toes in the Inspector General's water right now?
Yes, we got over 30 signatures on our bill. Over 30 signatures. Mm-hmm. So that was really encouraging. And when you have, folks from different perspectives going around the room to their various folks and saying, would you sign this? and they do. They say it's good legislation. So to get over 30 folks to sign, I really believe this has some legs. I know Ian Donis had called me up. I did an interview by phone. He said that he had talked to the governor, and she was open to looking at it. The speaker, according to Ian Donis in his 20 Things to Know that he just posted today, said that he had concerns about the cost of having another government entity. But this is an entity, I think, that has shown that for every dollar that is saved, it can generate many dollars more, maybe up to $12, 12 to 1, on many times on cost savings.
Now, what's the next step? I mean, which group does this go through? Judiciary? Does this go through
House Finance?
Okay, so it goes through House Finance.
Yep.
And ultimately, under whose budget does this come?
This is going to be a state-funded prerogative. So like anything else, like again, last year in a $60 million deficit budget, they can find $770,000 to hire 3 politically connected magistrates. Well, I'm sure they could find $1 million if this was important. So we want everybody. We want to get a meeting with the speaker. And we talked about that. The 5 of us talked about getting a meeting with the speaker. We also talked about, at the end of the session, they always ask, what are your top 3 priorities, that you list down that you'd like passed. We all said we got to get as many of our colleagues as we can to put the Inspector General as number 1 on their list. And so, that's another thing we're going to do. So that's a couple of ways we're going. And of course, I know to get phone calls or emails to the State House, to the Speaker's office, 1,000 emails or 1,000 phone calls. I mean, that would begin to show that people want this, that it's important. So that's the other aspect of it. We've got to get people really lobbying and speaking on behalf of this legislation. So when I had the press conference, I invited folks from the housing community advocacy. And I also invited folks from the homeless advocacy. I invited the folks, Mr. Bastia, Ed Bastia from the Catholic schools, because I have another bill in that, we have 15,000 underserved families educationally in the state, and many of them are in the Latino community. And so I've been working with Mr. Bastia. We put a bill in. The bill would raise the credit, scholarship, create scholarship money, credit for businesses. Businesses would donate. They can take a tax credit, and I guess the threshold right now is $1.5 million. That's the cap that we can have businesses donate and take credit. So my bill would raise that cap to $5 million, and that would allow many more students who are underserved right now. And I've been talking to many of my Latino friends in the Latino community about supporting that bill. But again, it goes back to whatever the cost would be. They say we don't have the money, and I say, well, if we had an Inspector General, we could find the money. And you really talk about fundamental rights, and Stephen Brown talking about that. I think quality education definitely is a fundamental right. And when we've got 15,000 underserved children, and the thing about this bill that is, and I repeat it again and again, is it does not take a single dollar away from public education. And the students, for the most part, that would benefit from this, they have to be 250% below the federal poverty level. So we are really talking about meeting a real need. And so, those are the kind of things I'm talking about, housing and homelessness and education, the things that this Inspector General bill could really help with, finding additional funds, efficiencies, and, avoid waste. And so that's the kind of thing I'm working on, really, I think, financial and people-centered.
Right. When will you hear, or have you heard yet, about this being heard in committee? Do you have a sense of that yet?
They really haven't. They've been doing a lot of preliminary stuff. Every bill that I put in, or any member of my caucus puts in, our office administrator puts in a request for a hearing. So we know we'll get a hearing. It just, you don't know, when that could be. It could be this month. It could be another month. It could be May. So it really depends. The chairman really schedules these hearings. But the fact that we ask for a hearing, we do get a hearing.
It's clear through the PawSox situation that the speaker has finely tuned his ear out to constituent concerns. His
Well, yeah, and he had quite the opponent last time, Stephen Frias, and of course the car tax relief and the PawSox were the two big things that Steve Frias really impacted this legislature with. And you talked about Tony Pyrus earlier, and I got to share this, but I watched the hearing. I was going to testify, and you were there that day, testified against the PawSox bill. And Tony Pyrus the night before, the Chairman Abney had ended the session, and he said, "Oh, wait a minute, Mr. Pyrus was Director of Administration for Pawtucket." He said, "Oh, he's got something we'd like to say," and he did say he was formerly the head of finance, and he said in his closing remark. He said, "I stood on the hill in the back lawn of the State House, and I looked over the city of Providence, and it was a desolate wasteland. And and then this person came in. I think it was a Pyramid Corporation, in the name he used, and he said, he was like the savior of Providence, with getting the convention center and all these things, the mall built and all this stuff. But what happened is, of course, I said, and you heard me say this, I said, everybody's talking about this is PawSox, the 38 studios. I said, no, it's not. This is the convention center. This is where we were told from day one it would make at least $1 million. And in the paper earlier in the week, there was an article about the convention center, and they were saying that they had, we were giving them, anywhere from $20 to $30 million a year to stay afloat. But in addition to that, this past year, they lost $11 million. So that was not 20 or 30, it was $41 million. And, those numbers are crazy. And so talking about, you do that over 20 years, you're talking $600 million from an entity that was supposed to make $1 million, at least $1 million from day one.
A couple million here, a couple million there. After a while, that could add up to some real money.
It really does. And so I sent a letter this past week to the Convention Authority asking them, because they talked about how much money they generated for the city and the state. They talked about the different positions, the folks that they hire there, and how many events and major events they have, because, we've taken issue previously, the caucus, the Republican caucus policy group, we've taken issue with the number of events they have there that even if they had never built the convention center, they would have no more events than they would if they still had the Dunk, just using the Dunkin' Donuts Center. That we really haven't had any more events than we would have had otherwise. And so they were mentioning all the different events they had. So I asked for a breakdown of the events, all events, major events, the employees, the number of employees, I think was 8,000. So I asked, what are their jobs, what are their salaries, so, hoping to get some information back on the convention center, because, again, for me, to be investing $20 to $30 million in an entity, plus it lost $11 million on top of that, that just does not seem in any way, shape, or form.
I'm going to make a request for you. I'm going to ask that as part of the Convention Center Authority, there's a little building called the Veterans, the Vet, which by the way, is a beautiful spot, and I've been fortunate enough to see over the years my children play there. I've seen the Rhode Island Philharmonic play there. I saw Leonard Nimoy, interestingly enough, do a performance with children's choirs across the state in observance probably about 10 years ago, in observance of Kristallnacht, one of the most compelling performances I've seen in my life. But, and here's the but, we continue, this is my attempt at sophisticated humor, but I like to say that we have an edifice complex in this state. Not edifice, but edifice. And build it and pray like hell someone shows the hell up. And I'm convinced on a night like tonight, if the weather got much worse, we don't need to build disaster centers. We could probably, between the Ryan, the mall, the Dunk, the convention center, the vets, we could probably fit the whole darn state, into these buildings. So we build all this stuff, and again, where's the accountability? There should be, and maybe I've just missed it, but I believe that as part of a Commerce Corporation Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights being for the taxpayer, that A, first of all, I'm calling for the dissolution of the Commerce Corporation, B, the sale of the Convention Center Authority and all its buildings, but a economic report card by an independent third party. There's a town in Ohio called Dayton, Ohio, and folks who are URI fans may understand Dayton as the as one of the over the years a thorn in the side of URI's basketball team. Not so much this year, but they've always been a player in URI's league. People who are in the military understand that it's the headquarters of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The lead, my understanding is, currently the lead research and technology base for the United States Air Force in the world.
Mm.
They also have a minor league baseball team.
Yes.
And this little study became apparent to me because of the minor league baseball team. At one point in time, the Paw Soxeristas were all agog over, they were using Dayton as their example du jour. So I just Googled it. I mean, a tool, by the way, that I always commend to the Commerce Authority, they should try sometime. It's not very expensive. I think it's free. They could have learned a few lessons. But the city of Dayton uses an independent third party at arm's length of academics to do an economic study for the city on an annual basis. And they talk about in this study, it's remarkably accessible, it's out there on the web. They talk about, what the positive impacts, and what's working in the community. And they attempt to draw some real conclusions, based on numbers as to where it is, where it's going, and why it's there. And essentially acting as a report card. What was fascinating, it became to my attention because despite claims by the fine folks at your Pawtucket Red Sox Baseball Club that the stadium was a prime mover and shaker, this study didn't even mention the stadium.
Mm.
Completely absent. But at the same time, it went into some detail about what the other causes were to what appears to be a booming economy, which led me to two issues. Number one, the folks who own the Paw Sox are highly selective in their analysis of what towns are doing well. And unfailingly, they pick towns where you've got a great local economy and there's a minor league baseball club which is doing very well. Well, it's chicken and egg time. One would argue that the baseball club is probably doing well because of the high level of disposable income which is generated by a booming local economy. Compared to Gary, Indiana, which I do all the time, and the Steelyard as it's there, is a financial disaster.
Mm.
But the real takeaway, because there's always the symptom and the issue that brings you to a point, just like in all these different things that you're involved in now, was that do we as taxpayers really have any tool on an ongoing basis to analyze the performance of these, and I'm using the coalition air quotes now, assets? And I would argue that if these studies are being done, I have a feeling we're not hearing about them because if they were good news, Lord knows we would know, right?
Yeah, and that was one of the things in the article. They talked about the economic impact that they had. I don't know, it was maybe it was I don't even want to quote the number, but it was maybe $170 million impact. But again, just what you said, I think have an independent third party come in and make that determination rather than the entity itself.
Right.
And especially when you're losing that kind of money of $11 million a year in addition to the 20 to 30 that the state is giving you every year, and has been giving you for the last 20 years. I mean, it just doesn't add up.
No, it really doesn't. So I'm going to ask you if you could, in all that time, that 2 hours a night you've been wasting sleeping, to spend a few minutes of it. If somehow you could squeeze in, I'm fascinated by the vet because again, it's a beautiful building.
Yeah.
It's a lovely spot, but I just gotta wonder. It's one of those hidden little gems in Rhode Island government. And it's what was it that museum that no one could get beyond the gates to see that we spend $100,000 on somewhere over by one of the lighthouses. It's that hidden little gem that they're the ones that in the aggregate seem to cost us a whole lot of money.
Well, yeah, you've given me an idea tonight, so thank you for that. But I've got, as part of my look into the Convention Center Authority, I am going to ask the question, which wasn't originally part of the letter that I sent to them. It will be, I'm going to find out how they measure that economic impact, what agency or what entity do they use to make that. So that'll be fascinating to find out, and I will find out, and I will report back to you.
Excellent. Wow. So you and I could, we're never short of conversation, are we, my friend? We never really are. Tell folks how they can, we only got a couple minutes left, so tell folks how they can find you on the web. And, you know, more importantly, I imagine in the works is some sort of portal or information process. I'd love to help in terms of getting people out for this hearing, because I guess this hearing for the Inspector General's position is going to be critical.
Yes, it absolutely is going to be critical. So, yeah, we're going to really need people to turn out for that. And yeah, the easiest way to get a hold of me is go to my website, which is www.robertb, B as in boy, Lancia, LANCIA.com. Right. And that's got my connections and all my information, what I'm doing, where I'm going. In fact, tomorrow, my wife and I, we're proud every year since I've been elected. We're going to be over at the mall, the center court in the mall. We're going to be doing reading to the children tomorrow as part of the NEA Reading Day. So Cat in the Hat, Dr. Seuss. So it'll be a lot of fun tomorrow. We love doing that every year. So we stay busy. But that's the easiest way for people to get a hold of me. Or they can call my office, which is 222-2259. They can leave a message for me there. But go to my website, again, www.robertblancia.com, or they can call my office, 222-2259, area code 401.
Excellent. Well, Rep. Lancia, again, thank you for spending a quality Friday evening here with us at the Coalition. Continued respect and best wishes for all your legislative efforts. We're going to wake up tomorrow, and I think hopefully all, we've already had a tragedy, as you mentioned tonight, but hopefully all will be safe and sound, and power will get back on. But again, it will bring new light and new focus on one of several critical issues you're discussing today, which is when we get up tomorrow morning, we need to understand 911. That's just important stuff. So congratulations on all your efforts. And
no,
of course,
thank you. And you have a great evening. It's always good to be on the show, and keep up the great work.
All right, buddy. And
thank you.
And love to the bride, too. Okay?
Thank you. Take care.
Folks,
Bye-bye.
Robert Lancia, General Assembly Representative, District 16, the City of Cranston, joining us here live in the Coalition. Well, it's been a hectic night. We've got a couple of guests that had to postpone because, well, they simply had no power. So we're going to try next week another shot at our right to try legislation with the folks from the Goldwater Institute. We do have a local rep who I'm trying to get squared away so he can come in studio and also discuss it because legislation is pending. We're hoping next week to cover this controversy, this law that's before the Senate now, passed overwhelmingly, which will take away, well, let's just say it'll impact us on two levels. Number one, at its most primary level, folks who are involved in sex work, and we had a 3-hour conversation about that last week, folks who are involved in sex work will again be further marginalized, further pushed into difficult, unsafe situations, and will continue to push an industry that's as old as time into the shadows, where we'll all suffer. But at the same time, this legislation, just like the red flag tonight, that Mr. Brown spoke to eloquently too, just like any legislation that involves speech, will ultimately impact the rights given to us by birth, and that typically are nurtured in a free society. Sadly, we seem to be moving in a different direction. So with that, I say good night. Stay tuned. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Take time out, by the way, this week. There's some wonderful programming on during the day. I don't speak about it often enough. Here at Go Local Prov. You may know them as a news website, but on this same medium during the afternoons, you can watch hours, if you will, of great programming centering around everything from restaurant life to the business community to good old-fashioned bare-knuckle Rhode Island politics. As always, that and this show can be watched at golocalprov.com. So the important things are, please like us at facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Please follow us at Coalition_radio. And again, these and all other shows will live in perpetuity at coalitionradio.us. Take a moment. We'll rebroadcast along with this broadcast the hour-long show we did a couple years ago on WPRO, talking about why you need to belong to the American Civil Liberties Union, Rhode Island chapter. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be back next week.